Hi, I'm Steve. I made Microjig's ultimate workbench. If you'd like to see how I built it, stick around. Microjig designed some very useful dovetail clamps that work in dovetail grooves. They function essentially the same as T-track clamps, but you don't have to buy and cut T-track. You just route a dovetail groove. This workbench has grooves covering the top and sides and can also function as an assembly table, in-feed or out-feed table. It's got an adjustable height crank and locking casters. Microjig's plans are downloadable on its website. It looked pretty good to me, so I decided to build one. I started with a very sturdy adjustable height table from Home Depot. The link is below in the description. I bought the 52-inch by 24-inch version that came with drawers, but didn't end up using the drawer assembly. The top is solid finger-jointed wood about 1.25 inches thick. I decided this would work better than a plywood top because even Baltic birch plywood has some gaps in the layers, and the layers don't look as good as solid wood once they're routed. Step 1. Thicken the top. I needed to thicken the top, so I glued a 1/2 inch plywood sheet to the bottom of the solid wood top. The first step is to remove the top from the base and then remove the threaded inserts on the underside. The underside of the top has a finish on it, so I sanded it off to allow the glue to hold. I didn't film that part. I cut the plywood underside 1/8 inch larger than the top on all sides so that once glued, I could use a flush trim router bit to trim it flush with the top. The threaded inserts get reinstalled in the plywood bottom. I used the metal base to mark the hole locations. I was careful to use an awl to make the center of the holes, then started with a narrow drill bit, and then finally a 1/4 inch drill bit to make the holes for the inserts. I had my senior assistant helping me the whole way. Step 2. Vertical piece. I moved on to start cutting the 2 layers that make up the vertical piece. I used Baltic birch for the top layer and MDF for the bottom, both 3/4 inch thick. I made the plywood top layer 1/8 inch wider on all sides than the MDF bottom layer. I glued them together, making sure the plywood had a reveal on all sides. Instead of using my flush trim bit, I decided to trim the edges flush on the table saw. Step 3. Route vertical grooves. It was time to start routing dovetail grooves. Microjig has good plans for a vertical routing jig as well as a jig for routing the long grooves. I began by routing the vertical edges of both the top and vertical pieces. I clamped the top and vertical pieces together and routed dovetail grooves spaced 4 inches apart. I started off skipping the step of using the 1/4 inch relief bit before the dovetail bit, but it turned out the dovetail bit was getting very hot plowing through all that material, so I switched to using the relief bit first. Step 4. Cut aprons. It's time to start making the 5 inch wide aprons. The plans call for 1.5 inch thick by 5 inch hard maple stock. My lumberyard didn't have that, so I glued 3/4 inch stock together, doing my best to keep the grains matching on the top side that will show. Once glued up, I ripped them to 5 inches. Plans call for 1 inch half round holes to be cut out in the ends. This allows aprons that meet at 90-degree angles to have their dovetail grooves accessible. I used a 1 inch Forstner bit and put some scrap on the other end so the drill bit didn't have a tendency to travel. Then I cleaned them up with a 1 inch spindle sander. Step 5. Rout aprons. Once done, it was time for the rest of the dovetail grooves in the aprons. Using a 1/4 inch relief bit first and then the dovetail bit, I routed the aprons, routing across the grain before routing with the grain. That reduces the amount of tear out. I started routing 1 groove at a time, but it was taking a while to route 2 passes with a relief bit, 1 pass with a dovetail bit, and then moving the jig. I decided to make a new jig that allowed me to route 4 grooves without moving the jig, less bit changes. The jig has channels spaced for every other groove, so when I finished the 4 grooves, I moved the jig 4 inches and then routed the in-between grooves. Then I moved to the router table to route the long grooves with the grain. Leaving the fence in place, I could route the relief groove, then flip it to route the other side, then change the bit to route the final dovetail groove. Step 6. Attach aprons. With the aprons fully routed, it was time to glue them onto the top and vertical pieces. Because I was going to flatten the top, I didn't have to worry about making aprons flush with the top. I just concentrated on having the ends meet nicely. It was starting to look like a workbench. Step 7. Flatten the top. I made a router sled, dropped a piece of plywood on my table saw, and then put the top on it. The router sled's runners slide on top of the plywood sheet. The results came out great. The top was perfectly flat, and because I routed it in both X and Y directions, there was minimal sanding needed to remove the flattening bit marks. Step 8. Route grooves on face of the top and vertical pieces. Now the top and vertical piece were ready for grooves on their faces. I began with the vertical piece on the router table in case I made any mistakes. I wanted the top to be mistake-free. I again started with the cross-grain grooves, starting with 2 passes with the relief bit. Once all the relief grooves were cut, I moved over to the dovetail bit. On the top, I used Microjig's long routing jig. For the relief grooves, I got to know my router better and used the step turret stops to get 2 depths without changing the depth adjustment rod. There's a bit of cleanup needed on some of the grooves depending on the grain direction of the wood. I cut a 14-degree block to guide my chisel, and I removed the tear out. A few passes with some sandpaper, and it was clean and ready to finish. I had put a chamfer edge on all the stock, but I needed to do it again to the top after I flattened it. Step 9. Make dovetail hardware. To attach the vertical piece to the grooves on the top apron, I decided to make my own dovetail hardware from oak scraps I had laying around. I was too impatient to order them and wait for them to arrive. I ripped the oak down to be the matching depth of Microjig's hardware and clamps. Then I set my table saw to 14 degrees and cut the stock to match the width, 3/8 of an inch. Then I cut a 3/8 inch relief hole in the underside to accept the nut, then a 3/16 through hole for the screw. Then I cut each piece about 2 inches long on the bandsaw, used 2 nuts and some Microjig hardware I had lying around to embed the nut in the underside. Then I rounded the ends on the belt sander. Now I was ready to attach the vertical piece to the apron. Step 10. Add finish. I plan to use Danish oil on the faces and dovetail grooves and then polyurethane the faces. It turns out that the poly inevitably flows into the grooves and doesn't soak in, creating a blockage in the grooves. So I just stuck with the Danish oil. I also found that a bristle paintbrush works much better than a foam brush because the grooves chew up the foam pretty quickly and leave foam bits in the oil. Because I added 1.5 inch aprons on the side of my 24-inch top, the height adjustment crank no longer reached the edge. A little welding of a 10mm hex Allen key or rod extends the crank. You could also drill out the handle and use bolts and nuts to extend it. As you can see, it only took me 8 minutes and 53 seconds to build this. Pretty easy. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button below. This is my first video, so please be kind in the comments. Thanks for watching.